Hello everyone, today I will be making Ahsoka's offhand or Shoto saber from Rebels and the Mandalorian. I made the main hand saber in another video, so if you haven't seen that, be sure to check it out. For the templates, I used the templates from SKS Props. I said this in my last video and I would like to say it again, I'm definitely not trying to steal his content. I am just using his templates and this is my video of how I did the project. I think you should definitely check out his video where he made these sabers. They look totally awesome. Anyway, I started by printing off the templates and gluing them together. I cut out the main body of the small saber. I then took a sheet of plywood that was 5/32 inches thick. I traced the template onto it and then flipped it over and traced it again. I would need twice the thickness that this wood is. I then went and used a jigsaw to roughly cut out the two pieces. A bandsaw would be super helpful here, however, I don't have one, so I just used a jigsaw. I then took some wood glue and glued the two pieces together. I clamped them and let them dry. Once it was dry, I used the belt sander and sanded down everything to be pretty flush together. Next I took some sheets of basswood from Hobby Lobby. They are an 1/8 inch thick. I then cut out the center of the template and traced the body twice onto the basswood. I cut out the whole thing using a rotary tool, and don't forget to cut out the center. I also used the rotary tool to sand it a bit. I then used some wood glue and glued it onto the saber body. I clamped it together and don't forget to wipe up any glue that might ooze out. I then did the same for the other side. After that, I was able to use the belt sander again to get it nice and flush. I also rounded off the edges as shown. I went to a pretty fine sandpaper at the end just to get everything smooth. Now because this is wood, it had its imperfections. I used some of this plastic wood to fill in gaps, and when it dried, I sanded it down. Next, I took a yardstick. You can really use any wood that is about 1/4 inch thick. I traced the end of the saber onto it and traced around that a bit to get it to be a bit bigger. I cut out and sanded the piece. I then glued it on the bottom of the saber. It ended up being a bit too big, so I sanded it down to the size shown. I took another sheet of basswood, but this time it was 3/32 inches thick. I traced out 5 sections that were 1 by 1.5 inches and cut them out. On one of them, I drew around the corner to round it off, and I did so with the rotary tool. I then traced that piece onto 2 of the other pieces and sanded them down to the same size. With the next piece, I traced a bit around the inside because I needed it to be smaller, and I sanded down those last 2 pieces to that size. I then glued all these pieces in a big, small alternating pattern. And then I glued that entire piece onto the bottom of the saber. Next, I took this clip part from the template and traced it onto the yardstick. I also traced out another piece that was just as wide as the clip, but about 3/4 inches long. I cut them out, and to drill the little hole in the clip, I sanded it out using the rotary tool. Now to make this little detail, I again cut out a piece of the yardstick, and I used an attachment on the rotary tool to add the little circle detail. I then glued it onto the clip. I then used the rotary tool to sand down part of the piece of this body so I could glue down the clip and it would be flush. Now there is a gap right here, and I took a little scrap piece of basswood to fill it in. I then glued on that extra piece that I cut out before to the very bottom as shown. For this little knob, I traced the template onto the yardstick again and cut it out. I also gave it a bevel with the rotary tool. I used the rotary tool again to add a detail. I then glued it onto the saber. Oh, and I decided that the clip on the end came out a little too far, so I sanded it down a bit. Next, I cut off this little piece at the top of the template. I traced it onto the saber and cut off that part. The end was a little jagged from the saw, and I sanded it down to get it smooth. I took this little semicircle from the template and traced it onto the piece, and used the rotary tool to sand out that area. On the top, I drew this outline and used the rotary tool again to sand out that area. I then had a piece that looks like this. I traced the top of the saber onto the basswood that was 1/8 inch thick. I drew around the outside because I needed this piece to be a bit bigger. When it was cut out, I glued it onto the saber and used some sandpaper just to get it down to the correct size. I then took this piece and glued it on top of that. Next, I took this piece of the plywood from before and I traced a circle onto it that was about 1 1/8 inch across. I used the rotary tool to round it off into a dome. I traced the flat part of it onto basswood that was 3/32 inches thick. I traced around the edge again because I needed it to be bigger. I then glued that onto the dome and then hot glued that whole piece onto the top of the saber. Next, I took the template for the button and traced it onto the wood that was 3/32 inches thick. I traced out the big and the small circle and cut them both out. I glued them together using some super glue. I referred to the template for where to glue it on. Next, I cut out a diamond from the template and traced it on a popsicle stick 4 times. I was able to cut those out using a utility knife. You just have to score over it a couple times and apply some force. I referred to the template again for where to glue those. On the emitter, I drew a circle that was about 1/2 inch in diameter. I used the rotary tool to sand it out and add a little bit of detail to make it look like an emitter. Next, I took this D-shaped ring that was 1 inch. I sanded out a bit of the clip on the end to get the ring to fit in there. I took a scrap piece of yardstick and glued it over the top of that to hold it in. Then when it was dry, I sanded it down to be a bit more flat. Next was painting, and I gave the entire thing a coat of black that would also act as a primer. However, my camera ran out of battery and I didn't get the footage of me spray painting it. I sanded down the whole thing just a bit with a sanding block. Now, I needed to tape off all of the areas that I wanted to be black. Those areas were this top part of the button, the middle part of the saber, and the knob. I then gave the saber a quick coat of gold. I didn't actually have to paint the whole thing because there wasn't that much gold on the saber. I taped off the areas that needed to be gold, which were the rest of the button and the dome of the emitter. I then gave everything a coat of silver. However, this time my SD card ran out of storage, so yeah, I just keep running into camera problems. Anyway, it's pretty self-explanatory, I just gave it a coat of silver. And I was then able to pull off all of the tape to reveal the final product. There are some areas that the paint seeped under the tape, and I used a black Sharpie to cover over those areas. Alright everyone, thanks for sticking around this long. If you haven't seen the video where I made the main hand saber, go ahead and check it out. If you liked the video, consider dropping a like, and if you want to see more content like this, consider subscribing, it helps out a lot. Thank you, see ya.